Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty. If you're new here, I'm very glad you found me. I have something special for my channel, which is a big review today of this brand new Gemini II electric die cutting machine. Now I want to say right off the bat that this is not sponsored in any way. I bought this machine on my own. So I want to invite you to watch me walk through putting this machine to the test. I'm going to be throwing lots of materials and ideas at it to see how it performs, and I will share a lovely project with you briefly at the end. I'm hoping the information I share will be helpful to newbies to die cutting, as well as seasoned crafters. So let's dive in. As I show you the actual unboxing of this machine, I wanted to talk just for a moment about an electric die cutter versus an electronic die cutter so that the terminology is clear. Electronic die cutters, like a Cricut, Brother Scan and Cut, and so on and so forth, use your computer software to tell the machine to cut images. An electric die cutter uses the same manual dies that a regular manual die cutter uses. It just has power to assist those materials moving through the machine. So that is the difference. And as I was chit-chatting about that, I have managed to get to the inner box of my machine here. And I should say that I got this as a pre-release on the Home Shopping Network as a bundle, including that little box, which will open at the end of the video. This pre-release means that the machine actually isn't available until June. So you can see here there's a user's guide and a little bit of a catalog. In the bundle, there was also access to a new program that they're starting called the Gemini Club or something like that. I'm not going to go into that right now, but I do want to talk a little bit about why I bought this machine in particular. I had been looking at upgrading my manual die cut machine to an electric, and the original Gemini was on my short list. And when I saw the brand new Gemini, I thought now was the time to get in on the electric action with brand new features. So you can see this machine comes with all of the cutting plates that you will need. And if you're new to die cutting, all of these parts and pieces are used in layers to help you get the best results depending on the technique that you're using with your materials in your machine. And if you're a seasoned die cutter, I'll show you tips and tricks on how to make this particular machine the best to its abilities. Now I pulled the machine out of the box and it is heavy. The motors in here are supposed to be pretty powerful, and the weight I think will show that. I'm going to pull this out and we'll take a look at it. This built-in Lazy Susan was a small part of the HSN bundle, which I think is like a $10 value, so it's not a huge perk, but I definitely wanted that feature and I knew I would get it anyway, so that worked for me. I am opening up all the flaps here. This stand is intended to put a tablet on. I don't have a tablet. I do have a phone sometimes that I use while I'm crafting, so I might do that, but I'll show you lots of ideas for that little stand later. Now each of these sides open up to create a large platform for your cutting plates. You cannot put the cutting plates in from the back machine. You have to load them in from the front of the machine, but it does have a reverse button to bring it back out again if you need to use it that way. But the Lazy Susan feature makes it really easy to access the back of the machine, so I don't imagine using the reverse button too often. And I skipped over the fact that there's storage in those fold-out trays for now, but we'll cover more on that as we go. Looking through the materials that the machine came with, there's this little product catalog that touts the benefits of this particular machine, and it does say that it cuts multiple layers of material. Later in the instructions, I found that it referred to fabric in multiple layers, so I am not so sure that it will cut multiple layers of paper, and I did not try that out this time around, but I did want to mention it just in case you see this and it could be a selling point for you, thinking you could cut multiple layers of paper. Just keep that in mind, that it is unclear what that means. All right, and now it is time to go ahead and turn our machine on. There's a power button on top, but there's a main power switch at the back of the machine. So both of these need to be on. When the green LED light is on, that means you've got full power and you're ready to go. Here, I am just laying my ruler around on the machine. I don't have the exact size specifications of this because the pre-release bundle has disappeared from HSN, so I don't know the specifications. It might be listed in the brochure somewhere, but here it just kind of gives you a general idea. And if you need to fit this machine in a particular space in your craft room, you'll have to do due diligence to figure out that sizing. Now, one of the selling features to me for this machine was the fact that it could cut 8.5 by 11. My old manual machine only cuts half that size. And so that is one of the reasons why I decided to go ahead and make the upgrade. Now, this media stand could hold a tablet, but I am going to experiment with different things that it could also hold, including your leftover sandwich pieces that you don't need at the moment. But that could get a little bit heavy. But let me show you what I think I'm going to do. I do have this stronger magnet sheet, and now I probably won't use that one in particular because the sizing is wrong, but I will have a piece of magnet sheet on that tray to hold loose dies as I'm working. This tool is a very handy die pick and cleaning tool that is from Spellbinders. Gemini makes their own version, but I don't own that one. I am brand new to Gemini in general, so I'm guessing that their tool probably fits better than what I have, but I wanted to show you what I have and how I'm going to make it work. So I'm going to go through this list of ideas and techniques as I put this machine to the test, and you'll see in a moment I have a box of supplies and materials that I'm going to put this machine through. And while I show this to you, I just wanted to say a few things about the features of this new Gemini versus older Geminis. Now, I can't really compare them because I don't have an older Gemini. I don't have any Gemini. I'm updating from a manual Sizzix crank machine. But this machine, because it's new to the market, is supposed to be faster and more powerful and quieter than the previous version, which if I'm going to switch to electric, I might as well get the more up-to-date version. And this one has more storage and features, including 3 USB plugs on the back of the machine, which I kind of breezed over earlier, but that is a feature if you're running out of electrical outlets in your craft room. All right, you just saw all the box of goodies that I am going to be playing with throughout this video. So we are going to do lots of testing of this machine. Let's get it started with just the very basics, and that is a simple die cut. So the sandwich for this machine is a white cutting plate, your material, your die with the cutting blade down to the material, the plastic shim, and then the top white cutting plate. Now you can see here, I'm new to electric machines. I didn't push all the layers enough into the motor, and it only caught the top plate. So here with the second try, I gave it a push across all of the plates, and that did the trick. So with the lightest possible sandwich, it did cut out okay, but we're going to talk about more sandwich options as we go. Before that, let's take a listen to this machine. So I want to do a live demo of the sound of the machine and show you that the motor itself isn't too loud, but depending on what's going on with your sandwich and your dies, you might get some disturbing noises. So first, let's see if we can make that disturbing noise happen. And that usually happens when you have a long straight edge on a die that's going 90 degrees in, or well, I guess, because the rollers are like this in the machine. And if you're coming in exactly parallel to the rollers, that can cause some disturbing noises to happen. And I have got a sandwich that I have been working on that helps reduce the amount of over pressure where you get a rim of the die impressed into the paper. So this sandwich so far seems to be the best for that. However, it can be the worst for noise. So let's see if I can get this terrible noise to happen. Okay, that wasn't as bad as it's been in the past. But you can tell that the motor itself is not too loud. But if you do find that you've gotten a really disturbing noise from your dies or your cutting sandwich, let's go ahead and offset the die a little bit. And that should make it quieter. Oh, I do have some tape sitting here. Put that aside. Let's see. Might be time to rotate my sandwich. I don't know how well that sounded, but it was just some slight little crackles and clicks as opposed to a big kerchunk. So that is a live demo of how this machine sounds. All right, I do have to continue on with voiceover because I do have competing noises in the space where I work. So I am going to do some more detailed die cutting next. And I think this is more realistic of more common die cutting that you're going to put your machine through, is doing interesting fancy things. So the sandwich that is recommended is your white cutting plate, your materials, your cutting dies face down to your materials, of course, then the clear plastic shim, then the magnetic shim, and then your top white cutting plate. And then I go ahead and feed that into my machine, remembering to give it a slight push and wait for it to come out the other side. I do like the speed of this machine just fine. However, they did say that it wouldn't fall off the end, but I'm finding that it's kind of out of balance there. Sometimes, and most of the time, it has been fine, but I have had it slip off of there a couple of times, so keep that in mind. And as I remove this from the machine, it did die cut all the way through. Now that Crafter's Companion die just die cuts a pattern. If you, oh, pardon my kitty, he does like to craft with me sometimes. His name is Jamie if you haven't been here before. As I was saying, that Crafter's Companion die right there cuts out a shape. And if you want it as an independent piece, you do have to use the frame that goes with it. And I will show you that a little more later. Like I said, this did die cut very well, but if you're new to die cutting, you may not expect to have to unhook all of these bits and pieces from your dies and your plates. So that's what this tool is for. Dies have holes in them for specifically this. The scrubby brush can poke through those holes, and if that's not working, the bigger pokey tool can help pop everything loose from the dies. So next up, I'm going to try a thinner sandwich. And like I said before, that can extend the lifespan of your materials. And I'm going to thin out my sandwich by eliminating the magnetic shim. And that magnetic shim, you can put the dies directly on, never cutting side down, always cutting side up. And that can help you hold things in place because you see here, I lost a die. Not only did that shim provide some thickness to this sandwich to help hold everything in place, but it can help hold dies in place as well so that they don't slip and slide on you. Now, without that magnetic shim there to add the extra thickness so the machine can supply enough pressure, it didn't cut all the way through. I have just paused the video here because one of the features of this machine is a reverse button. It doesn't work just to hit the reverse button though. You have to go ahead and hit the pause button and then hit the reverse button. But that is there so that you can run the same cut through the machine multiple times so that you can get a more detailed die to cut out if it's being finicky. I did not find that worked. I prefer the sandwich with the magnetic shim in there. Here I am trying the sandwich with the metal cutting shim in there instead of the magnetic shim where you cut directly onto the metal. I am not liking that particular sandwich for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons being that it's warping that metal shim quite a lot, and I'm not getting any better of a cut. So you can see here some of the parts cut and some of them didn't. So with that metal shim there, I decided to make my sandwich the thickest it can be, and that is not recommended because this shim totally warped and embedded the dies into this metal shim. So that is not a good sandwich with all of the layers in there. However, earlier I did mention this sandwich where you have your cutting plate on the bottom, your paper or other material, then your die face down onto your material and your cutting plate. And then we're going to layer up this sandwich with the plastic shim and then the metal shim, instead of using it as a cutting surface, just using it as a shim in the sandwich, and then our top cutting plate. And we can run that through the machine. And I'm actually finding I like that sandwich pretty well using the metal shim in place of the magnetic shim. I'm getting pretty good cuts. So in the end, I would recommend you use one of those shims and figure out which one works the best for you. So talking about cleaning out our dies a little bit here again, I want to show you how I do mine. I do have the scrubby tool and I will use my die cut straight on a piece of foam and use that scrubby tool right on my die cut. And I find that it is not too rough and it does a pretty good job of getting all those little detailed pieces out of the die. And it looks pretty clean. So I do recommend having one of those tools. All right, next up is using a more detailed die that both embosses and cuts and pierces at the same time. So we are going to create the standard sandwich for doing this with the magnetic shim and the plastic shim that is recommended in the book. So when I pull this out of my die cutting machine, you can see I use that metal shim to hold my die in place so that it wouldn't slip around on me. And that was very helpful. So between the magnetic shim and the plain metal shim, you can decide which one is appropriate for your needs. So you just saw me check off those items on my to-do list, and we are going to move on to embossing folders, which is another typical use for die cutting machines. I'm going to start off with a plain embossing folder, which you just sandwich between your two white plates, and it comes out. Now, the first time I tried this, it seemed to crack my cardstock, and I was a little concerned that there was too much pressure, and I didn't think about how you could possibly remove pressure from this sandwich. But if you give a spritz of water to cardstock, that helps soften it so that it takes the pressure better through the machine. So I did go ahead and check regular embossing folders off my list, but when we move on to 3D embossing folders, I made a mistake reading the instructions. So I went back at some point and noticed my mistake in that this part of the instruction booklet says that you can use that clear plastic shim as a top plate in your machine. And earlier in the book, it had said something about only using these white plates to touch the roller. So I am not sure how those two pieces of information fit together. Perhaps that information on the cutting plates was only in relation to the dies. So when I used the instructions, the way I thought they were listed was to just use the two white cutting plates and run that through with 3D embossing folders. It worked just fine. However, they do recommend using this sandwich instead. So you start with your white plastic cutting plate. You take your 3D embossing folder with your materials inside. You add the magnetic shim and then the clear shim. So the magnetic plus the clear is slightly less thick than one of the white cutting plates. So this reduces the pressure on your machine and your embossing folder to help prevent damage in the long run. So I ran that through the machine and it came out the other end. And it looks beautiful. So I would definitely recommend that sandwich for this. I did try that sandwich with the regular embossing folders, and because they are thinner, it wasn't quite enough thickness to prevent things from slipping and sliding around as it ran through the machine. Okay, we've covered all of the basic techniques. We're going to move on to a couple of things that are less common, although they are becoming more common. And the first one of those is embossing with a die instead of an embossing folder. And that actually has instructions in the instruction book, so it is not uncommon. It is just less common. So here's our sandwich: white cutting plate, then this pink rubber or silicone mat, I'm not sure what the material is, then your paper, then your die face down into that paper and mat, then your clear shim, and then your top white cutting plate. Now you can see that I'm having a hard time feeding this into my machine because my plates are getting bowed as I'm doing all these trials, and we'll talk more about that later. Now I just pointed out that the pink, I call that the tongue, kind of sticks out, stretches out as it runs through the machine, and that's normal. However, instead of embossing, this all cracked my paper. So I'm double checking my sandwich, and I had the sandwich correct, but it is just too much pressure. So I am going to make my sandwich thinner. So I start with my white cutting plate, my pink pad, my paper, my die, and then I'm using the magnetic shim instead of that clear plastic shim. And that actually does pretty good. So I wanted to test this one more time with an even lighter sandwich. I eliminated the shim altogether, and that did nothing. So then instead of the magnetic shim, I tried the thinner metal shim, and when I ran that through, it also did nothing. So it does need the magnetic shim. And while we're talking about the magnetic shim, let's talk about the benefits of this. So far, we've used it mostly as a shim. Now let's use it as a magnet. So I am going to line up my die on the shim using those grid lines so that I can align my image into the center of my cardstock. So there are measurements on one side of this magnetic shim that works for A2 size cards, and I am building my sandwich upside down, and you can totally do that with this machine. So my blade is facing up into my cardstock, and then I put my rubber mat on top of that, and then, oh, I'm showing you here how staticky that mat is. That's a whole nother issue. And then you put your top plate on, and you can run it through just like that. So this actually helps prolong the life of your plates as well. If you make your sandwiches right side up, upside down, rotate your plates first left side in, then the right side in, all of that helps your plates last longer. So this came out okay. The edges were less embossed than the center. And while that was a selling point of this machine to have even pressure across, I did not find that to be true. All right, I am moving on to a technique that I actually learned fairly recently, which is embossing with stencils. So let's go ahead and build up our sandwich. I have got my cutting plate down and then my pink embossing mat. Material first and then your stencil. So we're building it much like embossing with your die, where instead of using a die, you're using a stencil. I'm going to tape things into place a little bit. Then I've got my clear shim and my top plate. I'm using the clear shim instead of the magnetic shim because stencils are thinner than dies. And I thought that extra pressure would help. And you can see our tongue poking out from that rubber mat. And when I open everything up, it looks beautiful. This is exactly what I expect from embossing with a stencil. Checking that item off of my list, and I realized I forgot some items. So I'm going to add those onto this list, and we will tackle these as well. Now we are going to do some partial die cutting, and I'm finding it a little challenging with the electric version of this machine. So I am building my die cutting sandwich just like I would for any die cutting, but trying to figure out how to feed this in with offset plates. And that's the partial point of this partial die cutting. Wherever you have a full sandwich, it creates full pressure to cut in that area. But the edges of my plates had full pressure and left a crease in my partial die cut. Now that was okay for this case because I was creating a little open window, but it did leave that crease across the entire project. I want to add my own crease later so that it doesn't go all the way across the project. So switching up my sandwich, I have my white plate, the clear plate, no magnetic shim, and then my top white plate. And I have to hold these carefully to get them to feed through, but that did the trick, and I have a nice clean partial die cut. All right, the final extra that I'm testing this machine on is using non-Gemini plates. Not cutting plates, but a cutting mat. I do love these magic mats that come from scrapbook.com. I've been using them for quite a while in my Sizzix, and I wanted to test them out in this machine. So I am using it as a replacement for all of my shims, and I'm cutting straight into it. So I've got white cutting plate, my magic mat cutting plate, and then my top cutting plate. Now these are different sizes, so it's a little awkward to get it through the machine. And the pressure was a bit strong with that sandwich. So I need to experiment with that one a little bit more, but I wanted to include it in this video in case you're an experienced die cutter and you're using magic mats, or you have other brands of plates that you want to experiment. I can't speak to the warranty of your machine because I may have voided my warranty by using these, but I wanted to show you just in case that's your situation also. So if you've made it this far into the video, you must be getting something useful out of it. So I would so appreciate if you could hit that like button, go ahead and leave me a comment, and then complete watching the video all the way to the end, because those three things really do make a huge difference in YouTube land in supporting my work here. So thank you, and now back to the die cutting. Now, paper isn't the only thing you can cut with a die machine, and hopefully if you're a die cutter, you already know that. But if you're new to die cutting, we are going to do cork, fabric, felt, tulle from the sewing department. We're going to do acetate sheets. We're going to do vellum. So I'm going to try and keep my materials to the same thickness as I put this through. I'm going to use the standard die cutting sandwich to start and work my way up to different sandwiches from there. And with fabric, and there is vellum. I've got some crepe paper. It's a thick crepe paper, but still kind of a crepe paper. The fabric worked, and then you can see here my die embedded in the cutting plate with the tool. So that was too much pressure for that thin type of material, and the tool wrinkled up on me and left a weird edge. So make sure your materials don't curl up on you as you're running them through the machine. And then I turned to thicker materials, but I kept my sandwich the same just to try it out. I've got some cork, which cut nicely. I've got some watercolor or really heavy duty cardstock. The felt cuts nicely. The foam was actually overcut. There was too much pressure on the foam. So I'm going to try all those materials again, removing the magnetic shim. It did not cut the felts. It didn't do a great job with the extra thick paper, but it was perfect for the foam. And don't worry, I will cover all of these in a chart that you can download and keep with your machine. I'm going to size it to fit in the machine, and you can keep this handy chart for all of these materials. All right, next up I am cutting acetate, which some people have said has cracked on them. I don't cut it very often, and I've never had it crack on me, so I don't know. I am going to skip the metal shim to reduce the pressure to see if I can avoid any possible cracking. And when I pull it out of my machine, it did not cut through all the way. So I go ahead and put my sandwich with the metal shim in there, or the magnetic shim, sorry, and it was too much pressure. So I am pulling out that metal shim to cut into, and I'm trying other materials at the same time. It did cut the acetate just fine. So that is one good use for cutting into the metal shim. So I know we went through that all really fast, so let's do a slower recap. So with a basic sandwich of bottom cutting plate, clear shim, magnetic shim, top cutting plate, I was able to cut all of these materials. So fabric cut, we have heavy duty cardstock and watercolor paper, that cut, cork cut. This one is foam, but that was overcut. The felt cut tool, I've got some crepe paper that cut even detailed flowers and such. So those all cut great with the standard cutting sandwich. So if you take out the magnetic shim, you get better results with craft foam and sometimes with cork, depends on your die. All right, if we're going to cut certain things like acetate, cutting into that metal shim is helpful, and it can work better for fabric and odd fabrics like tulle. So those are use cases for cutting into the metal shim. And you can see I cut various things, including felt. Again, I will have a chart for you that you could download, print, and store with your machine should you happen to purchase this machine. Let's do a little bit of a wrap up of this experience. My top cutting plate, I kept the same the whole time, and I know this is not recommended because you want to rotate your plates in order to evenly distribute wear and tear. And that plate was fine. My clear plate was fine. My pink rubber / silicone mat had some impressions into it from that one cut that had too much pressure, but it didn't cut through the rubber, which I was really worried about, and it's fine. So I am calling that one pretty good. You will notice I just scrubbed it off with a microfiber cloth, and that's because that thing has static like mad. Cat hair, glitter, my hair all sticks to this thing. And while it's not an issue for using it, it just kind of looks tacky. Now, the magnetic shim, when used directly on top of your dies, does leave impressions in the magnet. I don't know how long this will hold up without, getting too lumpy and bumpy. So we'll see how that goes. Now, the metal shim, as I've said, was not something I particularly liked using. It did have that couple of use cases with cutting fabric and acetates, and it worked as a shim in place of the magnetic one for reducing overpressure. Now, it is metal, so you can kind of unbow some of the wear and tear on it, but you can see the indentations. And definitely don't use all three of these things together because that will really damage your plate. Now, I kept this plate as my bottom cutting plate the entire time. And for the most part, I ran my sandwich in the exact same way, cutting on the exact same side, and it caused my plate to bow just with this much of a die cutting session. And that bowing caused it to not make a tight sandwich to feed through the machine, and that was problematic. And it caused my pieces inside the sandwich to slip and slide around, so that was problematic. I did unbow my plates using a hot water trick from Jennifer McGuire. I'll link you up to her video. These plates are a slightly different chemistry, but it worked well enough that I am happy with my plates the way they are. The moral of the story here is that you do need to rotate your plates in order to prolong their lifespan, which will be super short if you don't. All right, in terms of my overall use of the machine, I'm totally happy with this machine. I am satisfied with my investment. I am learning its quirks, and I am making use of some of these features to my advantage. I like that little media tray for storing materials as I'm working. I can fit in a roll of tape for tacking things down. You can see I have leftover tape tacked to the inside of that lid, and that is a nice place to keep it out of the way. I can fit my Spellbinders die tool in there just barely. If I squeeze it all closed, it fits, so I'm gonna go with that. And I have a space for my little foamy mat for using with that tool to clean up my projects. So that wraps up the review. Let's go ahead and take a look at a project. I'm not going to explain every step of this project, but I will say if you have gotten useful information out of this video, I do have shopping links for these particular dies down below. And if you use my shopping links, even if you don't want to buy these particular dies, if you use my shopping links, I do get a very small commission and it doesn't cost you anything extra. And it helps keep my supply stack filled with dies and materials to bring these types of videos to you. So some of these are scrapbook.com dies. I've got Concord and Ninth dies, and this this hummingbird and floral set is from Concord and Ninth. So I will link those up in the description below. So if you're doing any shopping from scrapbook.com, a cherry on top, or a couple of other places, that is an easy way to say thank you to me for the content that I provide. So let's go ahead and build this project. Before we do that, I wanted to let you know that I am using some felt in this project, and here's a reminder, do not cut felt with fine detailed dies. For my card base, I am using that stencil embossed piece, and I cut it down to be a layer on the front of my card. I have pre-cut a whole bunch of florals, sprigs, greenery, all in various materials from vellum to felt. I've got a basket from scrapbook.com and more greenery cut out of felt from one of the other die sets. All right, building up this card, I have a few more materials. I did start to add glue to my card front before I realized, oh yeah, I want to ink that. So I did go ahead and grab a little ink cube, and I am going to swipe it across the raised area of this embossed piece. And ink cubes are great for this technique, and I didn't need it to be perfect. There are other techniques for doing this, but this one was good enough for me. And a little bit of inking around the edges, and I am going to put more glue on that and get that adhered down. Now, moving on to the basket, I am going to adhere this in a specific way. I put glue around the edges of my basket, leaving the top open, and I'm going to put foam dots in the middle of this basket to create some depth to it to help build up the layers of the florals behind. I'm going to start by adhering it in the middle and then kind of tip the edges of that basket down to give it some 3D dimension, and you can see here how it has just a little bit of dimension and room for layering these bits up. And from here, it is just a process of layering things in a way that is pleasing to you. I like to put my softer items towards the back so they add kind of a shadowy effect in the distance. I will trim some items. I will duplicate some items. I definitely cutting apart bits and pieces here and there and just layering them up in a way that I like and I think is pretty. And when I get enough layers in there, I'm going to add my felt on top of that. Felt needs extra glue because it is a fabric that just kind of soaks the glue up. So be sure to add plenty of adhesive if you're going to use felt. And here is what it looks like at this point. I'm not going to do too much more to this card, a little bit of dimensional drops to add some centers to my flowers. I will add a sentiment tag that I'm just going to hand cut and stamp and finish it off with a little bit of a natural twine bow, and that calls it good. Now I have one last thing to show you from that bundle that I purchased, and that was the little goodie pack. These goodie packs I'm not sure, sold independently, and I think they retail for $50, and they're packed full of stamps and dies. So if you're interested in the HSN bundle, it may come back at some point. Just keep that in mind. Or if you like these products, you can purchase these products individually. And if you want a much slower look at all of these, I will leave you a link to a private video that just takes a real-time look at unboxing these. And with that, I will say thank you, and thank you again for being here. I do appreciate you spending time here. I'm happy to provide useful information to all my fellow crafters out there. And if you're new here, I hope you'll subscribe and come check out more projects that I do beyond product reviews. Until I see you next time, have an artful day.